everyone. Today we have a special guest on Lana in the Sky. Today we have Madelin Adena Smith, who is a light worker and reader, and she works with energy. So Madelin, can you tell us more about who you are and what you do?
Yes, thank you for having me as well. So I am an astrologer, and that is I guess we could say that that's the skill that I've been working with the longest, or the tool that I've been working with the longest, apart from writing. But everything that I do is essentially an act of translation. So it's finding the words to contextualize what I'm feeling or picking up on. And it's moved in the past couple of years to painting, to developing a tarot deck, to reading. So I'm essentially bringing all these different elements together and finding the best way to communicate that.
Awesome. And what forms or mediums do you use to communicate and observe these messages?
So this is not going to be a direct answer to that question, but it's going to sort of elucidate something else, which is what are the distinctions between different types of healers who in some ways work all in the same field. So a part of what I do involves psychic work or involves channeling. And there's a distinction between, for instance, an astrologer, a tarot reader, a psychic, a medium. Those all do different things. Someone who practices Reiki, someone who does shamanism. Again, they're all tapping into the same field, but from an entirely different angle. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I feel like there's a lot of convoluted, you just do something in that sort of realm, sort of vibe. And there are a lot of psychics who are not astrologers, a lot of astrologers who are not psychics, psychics who do tarot who do astrology. Mediumship is a totally other thing, which is channeling the departed. So yeah, there's different ways of interacting and interacting with spirit, I would say.
And those are your abilities, mediumship and
just psychic, channeling. And psychic channeling. So mediumship is one of those things that is a bit funny or a bit tricky because it's something that I've in some ways always been able to do. I was born during a funeral. I'm a Scorpio, so I've always been around sort of the energy of the death tarot card. It's very comfortable for me, not in a goth sort of way or a creepy sort of way. It's just that energy feels very familiar. But I don't intentionally or actively do mediumship sorts of work where, I'm intentionally trying to grab that energy on behalf of someone else, because I feel like it's in some ways can take away from their grieving process, and it can lead to just a lot of interesting sorts of pathways or segues that they may not have gone down on their own. Now, other times I'm getting information and it feels like that if a spirit or a guide comes through and wants to make their presence known and it may be beneficial, that's a different thing. But it's more about, am I receiving them or am I looking for them? Those are two different energies. So it's not really something that I actively advertise.
So it's something that you like to allow to happen, but you don't seek it?
Correct.
And why is that?
I just feel like ethically, that's I guess that's a point that I revert to a lot, which is ethics and the morality of energy work. And sometimes, again, I feel like perhaps participating with that realm may be beneficial, but if that's going to be beneficial for someone else, I think that realm would be informing me versus me as Madelin, as an ego, is going out and seeking that. which way are we pursuing information? Is the information pursuing us, or are we pursuing it?
Right. So how did you know that you had these abilities? Like, how do you perceive this world?
So I will say that in terms of like receptivity, we'll call it that, in terms of intuition, something that goes slightly beyond empathy, I've had different phases of it through my life. There have been times where it's more quiet. There have been times where it's more activated or awake. There have been times where it's impossible to turn off. It depends on where I am, in terms of like geography, who I'm around, and also just, I think looking back, it makes sense because I see, okay, I was more open during certain parts of my healing journey than others and more closed at other times. So I think that there's a protective aspect to it as well. But it has been something that's been there with me since I was small.
Can you give us more insight to how you perceive these realms?
It's a good question because in a sense it's like being a fish in the water, I guess is the best way that I can describe it. It's like there's just your edge of your field is more like a gill. So it's like the energy just passes through. So whatever is in the room feels like, or whatever is in the quote unquote water, I will feel that. It's impossible not to feel it. At least for me. I've had a lot of different, I guess what you could call awakenings over the years, where the lights kind of come on in a really frightening way because you're not really prepared or ready or know what to do, or your conscious mind can't really filter or make sense of the information. A lot of that was during times when I was like under extreme duress, extreme stress, or in some sort of like near-death experience sort of scenario. It's just having a hypersensitivity to everything that is around you, noticing patterns everywhere around you, seeing connection in all things. And sometimes I think that the challenge for anyone who has this sort of antenna, it's what is a sign and what is not a sign, where it's like, I kind of put this work down to being like a radio station. It's like you're getting radio waves, but at times it can be like channeling different frequencies or different waves at once, and then it just comes in kind of as like white noise or just nonsense.
What kind of messages do you find significant into integrating into your life?
I'm going to answer this as best as I can. So when you're in a channeled state, it's in a sense, it's like being a resigned vehicle or being a vehicle who's in neutral. So whatever force is pushing, it will go in that direction. So it's important to be conscious in that moment as much as you can as a person, so that you are directing the energy and that there's sort of, you're not just completely like a leaf in the wind, that sort of thing. And it can happen to a lot of psychics, myself included, where you're a leaf blowing in the wind. But ideally, you're grounding that energy and you're not judging the energy. So whatever it is, it's coming through. So when I'm out of an ego state, meaning I've departed from the realm of what I consciously might call Madelin, and I'm just open, there's a lot more information that is available because the human psyche is not limiting it.
Can you tell us more about your channeling work? Like, what is it and what does it mean for you to channel?
So I worked for a period of time during COVID for a psychic hotline, and it was a really interesting job in terms of how I was hired, because it was the first job that I went to where it wasn't really an interview format. It was more, the people who were hiring me were like, okay, you tell us about us. So, for an hour, I just was giving them information about what I was feeling. And from there, I got the job. But every day while I was doing that, it was, I would say, 10 to 15 readings a day. So just a lot of training in talking to people of all different kinds. And I know I'm kind of digressing or going off course because that's just how I drive energetically. But what I loved about that work so much was access to a ton of different types of people, but also to people who may not, in normal or other scenarios, go seek help for certain issues. But a psychic hotline is sort of like, well, if I don't like what she says, then I can just dismiss it as hocus pocus. So it has a sort of truth or dare element to it that, traditional therapy or Western sorts of cultures do not allow for. It delivers the information and then it's free will from there. In some ways, it's like being a neutral post, like a neutral mailman. You're just delivering the mail.
So when you are giving readings on these psychic hotlines, you are in a channeling state, receiving the messages?
Yes. And sometimes it depends on how open the other person is on the other end. So when you say, like, can you give an example of channeled messages? It's really actually hard because the energy is dependent upon who is on the other side asking me to read for them. Some people have very bright energy. Some people have very low energy. Sometimes they don't need a psychic reading. They need reassurance or they need to be led somewhere else. But that's all operating under the realm of intuition. Sometimes it's just basic common sense.
So how do you get into this channeling state and what does it feel like?
These are such good questions because it's like I don't normally talk about like, well, what is the nature of your work and how does it actually function? Because usually I'm just doing it. There are definitely times during readings where I'm aware that I'm talking and I'm aware that there's sound coming out of my mouth and I'm very aware of certain sensations in my body, which I'm usually announcing, but it's as if something else has turned off. I'm seeing right now, I guess what you could call like a music editing sort of situation here. And it's like by turning the volume down on one sense or maybe on your judgment or on your ego, you're able to up the sensory field elsewhere.
It's fascinating. And I can relate because all of the dreaming experiences I've had my whole life, I've never verbalized as well. But when you start talking about it, it makes you think about it in a different way.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, you asked about like how the messages come, and I will say that I guess if I could say if I work with one sort of energy most frequently, it would be the energy of synchronicity, the energy of activation, and the energy of neutralization. So those are kind of the three things that I would say I'm given the most of in terms of energy.
So how does someone so sensitive like you achieve the ability to neutralize? Like, that sounds really hard to do.
Well, I guess we have to be clear in neutralizing what that really means. Okay, I'll put it to you this way. It's like having or being the princess and the pea, if you know that story, where the princess and the pea, she was stacked on top of multiple mattresses, but she could feel the tiny thing that was off underneath it. So energetically, it's just a feeling. You know when it's balanced and you know when it's not, and you can feel it come into alignment when it is. It's almost as if I can feel the scales calibrating. There's a sense of calmness and peace that comes, and you can energetically almost like hear a pin drop when you reach that vibration.
That's fascinating. Okay, let me rephrase my question. Okay, so the skill that you're talking about to tune in and to channel for these clients, it's like an exceptional skill that if we all had it, we could just be very calm in our lives. You know, but if you're feeling all these energies, how do you separate that from yourself? Like, do you ever feel bad, like, and you think that's your feeling? You know, like, are these just neutral, like the wind blowing on your skin, and you know that's not you? Or do you ever feel energies that kind of make you crazy? or
Both.
do they affect
Both.
your moods?
Yes. I think that as I've gotten older, part of my lesson has been learning detachment, or how to feel the emotion, not in a way that's, we're not talking about numbing it. We're talking about being able to recognize it as other or not yours. So it's being able to distance yourself from it and still allow it to pass through. But learning how to be able to do that and learning to distinguish what is and is not your energy, that's part of the challenge. That's par for the course for anyone who is energetically open. It's like we're saying, how do you like separate all of the droplets of water if you're in the tank? Sometimes it's like you can't do that. It's not possible. You're just going to experience all of it, whether you want to or not. So it can be overwhelming, but I think that, again, part of my journey has been, learning how to use energy, how to direct energy, how to calm or focus it as well.
And is that something that you've had to spend a lot of time doing?
A lot of time. It's been a lot of time. And I think that it's a practice that only gets better over the years.
What are the tools and techniques that you use to achieve these abilities to be able to identify everything that's separate and to control your states and emotions?
So for instance, this is a tarot deck. I'm just going to pull it out here. Scientifically, if you are bringing your hands together, you're actually joining or creating communication between two hemispheres in your brain. So this is prayer pose, which is why it's so powerful. So every time that as a reader I come here, I'm creating that union between hemispheres or balance. So what I really like about tarot is that, for instance, it's keeping both sides engaged at the same time. So in so many ways, it functions as this alternating current of energy, if that makes sense. So it keeps things moving. Now, if you're not in a good state and you read tarot, the messages, for instance, may be dependent upon that state, because you're going to read it and you're not really clear. I think even like ASMR, if you know what that is, it's very sound-based. If you even just listen to this, it's very rhythmic. It's very calming. So I think that it provides one with a sense of sort of restoring power.
Okay, so tell us more about your readings. How did you get into that?
How did I get into readings? So there have been a lot of different skills that I've picked up over the years. My first love was astrology. I started studying or learning astrology when I was 17, and I'd always been interested in it prior. But I was really raised, at least my mother was very pro stars and all of that. So for her, it was more of, I'm not going to say a trend, but it was just more, I don't think that she walked out of it at the end being like, I understand astrology. She understood herself. Whereas when I was so young and absorbent of all of the information, and I was so hungry for it, that it's like I just wanted all of the keys to the universe. I wanted my answers. And astrology was, in many regards, it was that gateway for me to understand things. I had a really confusing childhood. And I, no matter where I went or what book I read or whatever it was, no amount of education in a formal or traditional setting could really satisfy me, because I just felt as if there was a large portion of information that was just missing, and it was the part called context of why am I learning these things? Why are we here? How did we get here? What is happening here? Why are we just going through this sort of maze-like matrix sort of way of living? It didn't really make sense to me. So once I was able or gifted this ability to read, I felt like I understood mechanically, or I understood from a much larger and broader scale how and why we had arrived here. And by we, I mean not only myself, but also my ancestors, my parents, my family, and also just the collective. So it was pretty historical the way that I was going about studying it, but I read once that, like, it was a meme of some sort, and it said, or maybe I guess it was an infographic or whatever the word is, but it was talking about people who study astrology and them being interested in it because they are curious to understand others on the deepest level. And I think that that's true, because the only thing that I ever wanted when I was younger was just to be understood. It wasn't complicated. You don't have to like me. You don't have to dislike me. You don't have to, whatever. You just have to understand me. And there were so many things in life that I just could not understand. They did not compute. No matter how much I looked at them, how much research I did, how much healing I did, it just did not compute to my brain. Having that access to other people's charts allowed me to see them as individuals, allowed me to see other people as individuals and to see their life paths and their journey, what their soul came here to do versus what I might want to project onto them or what I might need from them. So it was a way of being able to, I think, appreciate someone for who they are, even if I don't necessarily agree with it or I'm not a fan of it.
So would you say that astrology gave you a clear picture of everything and acceptance of the way things are?
I can't say it gave me acceptance. I think that would be overselling astrology. But I think that it gave me a sort of ladder or a stairway to that point where over time I could start to understand things. And again, as long as I can understand, it's like the precursor to digesting information. You have to be able to just understand it first. So if I could package the energy in some way, even if it was not a traditional way, even if it's a way that a lot of people call pseudoscience, to me it was a valuable gift and a valuable tool because it could process the information for me.
Well, tell me about all of those intricacies. Like, how do you understand that, and how did you learn all of that?
So when you say that, do you mean the intricacies of astrology, or do you mean the intricacies of connecting?
Okay, let me ask another question. So when people think of astrology, they think of something that you read out of Cosmo magazine, right? Mm-hmm. It's like a daily blurb. So when I received your reading, it was much more intricate with all these houses and planets, and it was such a lengthy reading that I was like, whoa, like, what is all of this,
Right.
How do you know all of this? How do you learn all of this? And I mean, it was really accurate. It was really crazy. So yeah, tell me more about all of that. So, and like, what's the difference between that and like everything we see in just pop culture? Like, your reading is very different.
Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. But I think that part of that is the mentor that I had. I had the same mentor for nearly 15 years. So he was so good at what he did that in so many ways I feel like I just absorbed a lot of his way of seeing the world. And I've shifted from that, and I've developed my own way of seeing things. But I read a quote recently from a famous astrologer. His name is Robert Hand. He's a really old, tried and true, trusted astrologer, and very, very thorough. And he said a statement that I found really interesting on astrology that was basically about reaching certain standards in astrology. And he essentially said, so Robert Hand, who's an amazing astrologer, and he's well known and he's traditional and he is thorough, He's not, as far as I know, he's not on TikTok, and there's nothing wrong with that. But he often talked about like a standard of astrology and how it's not that we should lower the bar, and this is not verbatim, but it's more that you have to think about how broad of a subject it is that you're studying. So if you walk into astrology, it's like walking into the universe. There's so much content, and you could study one tiny thing for a very long time and get very specific on that, or you could in so many different ways bounce around. It's like being a telescope. Where are you pointing? So it's taken a lot of years to pin down the information, or for the information to stick, because you can study this for a while, but then it's facts that sort of leave. But you're left with a lot of learning after doing it repeatedly. So for anyone who would be starting something, and I'm just thinking ahead, if anyone was interested in astrology, it's like the fact that there's so much content to learn should not, as far as I'm concerned, be a barrier to learning it.
So when you were first beginning, I know you said that it was your mom that kind of introduced you to astrology and understanding the world. What kept you driven through all of the intricacies of it at first? Like, was it overwhelming? Or I know you said you had your teacher as well, but like, what kept you going?
I think it was just the feeling again of being understood and wanting to have that skill, wanting to have this sort of radiology view of the world where you're seeing people pass their containers into the x-ray of the soul skeleton, in a sense. So the fact that I could be understood so deeply, and I felt like I was ridiculously complex, it was something that was always in some ways nourishing for me, and it was in so many ways like a self-feeding system.
So was this feeling of being understood, was this from the reading from your teacher?
Correct.
Okay, and then after you had that reading and you saw that you could be understood in this way, you wanted to continue with that study so you can...
Well, I wanted to understand myself, and I wanted to understand the world. And again, I'd had like a lot of trauma and a lot of these inexplicable sorts of experiences. And at that time in the world, I mean, yes, to some extent the world is open, but I was living in Virginia in the South, and this was 15 years ago. You weren't going to go to your local therapist and be talking about the planets or the moon or your moods or certain sorts of psychic content that was coming up. So it was important for me to have something alternative that felt like it resonated versus this strange taboo that you're not supposed to ever talk about, which doesn't even really make sense.
How did you transition from helping yourself with astrology to helping others?
So my first group of clients, actually, I'm talking about this in terms of like what instilled my desire to continue with astrology, because I was really full of doubt. I really felt like I did not know enough to be an astrologer. I was like, okay, I sort of know this and sort of know that, and am I good enough, etc. But then I had a referral, and it was to a sisterhood, like a group of nuns, and they were all in their 70s, 80s. One of them was actually dying, or like in geriatric sort of care. But I was brought on as the trusted person for that, and with her passing, and it was really quite an interesting and strange opportunity to be given at that point, because I was only 23 or 24. So I'm getting these massive questions from these very spiritual people who have lived their whole lives as spiritual people, and they're coming to me saying, well, what do you see for me, and what are the next 6 months going to be like, and how can we create more community, and etc. And I think that working with them and working with them in the aftermath and with the grief really cemented my sense of wanting to help people through transitions, however they showed up, and in whatever way that I could show up.
Wow, that's a powerful experience.
It was really powerful. It was, and it was challenging as well, because there were certain things I could see in the chart that were indicating perhaps loss. And no, I don't tend to read, like I don't look at fatalistic sort of astrology. That's not my viewpoint of it, of what it's for. But there were certain things that I could see potentially transpiring, and at that moment, again, it's using intuition. So it's not about lying or telling the truth. It's about what is the information that this person needs to know, that they are also able to hear and integrate. So part of the reason why I think astrology and tarot are why they should be taught in some ways is I feel like it is a form of literacy. It's a form of self-knowledge. And I don't always feel like the dynamic that has been historical with astrologers is the person arrives, they know nothing, the astrologer knows everything. I don't love that dynamic, which is why I really add in psychic layers or add in conversations, because I feel like it should be a shared thing.
Okay. So we've been talking about astrology, and then you just mentioned your tarot reading.
Yes.
So can you tell us more about that? And is it something you do with your astrology, or are they separate, or both?
Both. So again, astrology came first, but once I learned tarot, it felt as if in some ways tarot had come first, because tarot is much more intuitive and it's much more pictorial as opposed to analytical and lines and calculations. It doesn't have that. So in some ways it's simpler and more accessible, and I think that it's about finding the right tool for the right moment and for the right person. And sometimes it takes a second to figure out what that is. Some people connect better with pictures. Some people connect better with structure. So it just depends. Usually if I either pull a spread or I talk to the person or I'm reading their chart, it somewhat becomes clear in the beginning how the person is in some ways wired to understand or receive information.
When you're reading the tarot, are you in a state of channeling as you're receiving information? Is there a specific technique, like for instance, do you meditate, or do you say a prayer, or do you do something to get into that state?
So I'm always, setting an intention, or to me, this is very meditative. It's very ritualistic. So it's something that when I arrive at my desk and there's a tarot deck in my hand or there's an astrology chart, it feels like the rest of me follows. It knows where it's supposed to be. It knows where it's supposed to go. So it feels very natural and automatic. But when I first started reading tarot, I really had to sit with the deck, and I really had to tune in, and I really had to be very intentional about it. That's not how it is anymore. In some ways, I know when it's time to read. It will come through very strongly.
Wow. Are you talking about the message coming through?
Yes. Or the timing of something. I feel in so many ways like I operate, and there's a lot of people, I think, who operate intuitively. In other words, they're on a more lunar timeline than a solar timeline. So what I mean by that is our calendar, like the Western calendar, is sun. It's solar. And our timelines are all, you're going to be here at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, etc. on whatever given day. But that's not how the moon works. The moon is, okay, for 2.5 days, the moon is in this sign, and then it's in that sign. So the mood is going to be very, very different. It's not, in some ways, lunar sorts of types of people, of which I am one, they're in motion. They're not, it's hard for them to stick to time and to timelines. So it's almost like we're talking about the moon, or we're talking about the moon and its pull on the water. So it becomes clear when there is something overflowing. We'll put it that way.
Does it kind of feel like you want to sneeze, but not like
somewhat?
Like sneeze,
it's
but
more
like
like
impulse of wanting to eject something.
It's more like, it's not quite a sneeze. It's more like, oh, there's like the urgency to run to the restroom. It's like you have to. It's when there's something that is trying to be released.
Okay, and these messages, what do they come in as? Like, is it an image, or is it knowing, or are they words that you hear? Like, how do the messages come through when you're working with these readings?
I know, because you're like, how, Madeline, but how? Make it tangible, but how? And
I'm just curious.
No, I know, but I think that honestly, it depends on who I'm around, or what I'm around, or what season it is. The messages will be very different. So sometimes it will be just colors or feelings. Other times it will be more like there's a smoke alarm going off, and it's like, you got to go do it now. So it's just something like you get a sense and you don't know why. And then you start to pull the reading, or you start to look at the astrology, and you're like, okay, this is making sense. So it's not about justifying why or how am I there. It's about understanding that there's a reason for that timing.
Yeah. I mean, I just ask the questions based upon what I know. Like, I don't even know if I'm asking in the right way. So however you experience it, of course,
there's like, I would say,
funnel your answer into what my question was. That's just all I knew how to ask.
I think that it depends on what is going on in whatever given environment I'm in. If someone is in a clearly distressed state, I'm going to feel that. If the collective is in a distressed state, I will feel that. There will be something to say. There will be something to transmute. There's some sort of energy that's trying to clear and make itself known. So it makes itself known in whatever way it is trying to make itself known, is the best way that I can put it. And there's different levels, there's different depths, there's different layers. So I think it all varies.
I see. So you said earlier that your experience with the nuns was kind of like the first foot in the door where you're like, yes, this is who I am. Since then, how else do you strengthen and fine-tune your skills? And I guess that grounding of your skills and your trust in your own intuition.
So there's a couple layers to this. Part of it is having a community of other people who may do similar things or the same thing, but their viewpoint is entirely different. So because of that, you're looking at the same picture, but you're seeing it through someone else's eyes. So it helps to widen your perspective of the same thing, whereas you can only interpret it one way, someone else may interpret it another. I would say like not really peer review, but peer interaction is definitely one of them. Besides studying, there's also, when I worked for the Psychic Hotline, for me, that was like, I'm going into training. And I don't know what I'm going to learn here, but I know that the act of repetition and of reading this many charts for this many people, you start to pick up patterns. So there's the element of pattern. I'm very experiential in the way that I learn. It doesn't make sense to me if I read it in a book. I have to actually physically play or interact with the energy.
That makes sense. So you had to practice it in real time with real people. Was that validating working for the hotline? How was that?
It was really a strange experience for me because on some levels, I feel like I've always had this quote unquote, this skill, but again, I came from an environment where maybe astrology was acceptable to an extent. Not really, but sure. But like then psychic is a whole other thing. That's a whole other realm. So I guess that my levels of acceptance have sort of dictated my journey, and or levels of self-acceptance have dictated the journey. And as I've healed a lot more, I've been able to serve a lot more because I'm not in fear of what I have to offer. But I was really afraid before, I guess, 2020 to share a lot of what I did. I was in a very shut down phase because I had a previous experience where it was like this, the psyche was too open. It was too open and it was flooding my field and I couldn't really turn it off. And I didn't have the skill set. And I guess the way that I can say this is I had a really strong channeled message in 2018 about a pandemic or about quarantines. And at the time, I just feared it. I feared it. And I thought I was also just making it up or imagining it. So there's the element of getting information before the time. So if you're making your whole reality based on the outside versus what your internal intuition is telling you, you may gaslight yourself in some ways because you're not seeing evidence yet of what you're feeling. Or it's like the outer reality could not, by any means, and was never going to confirm or affirm what I was feeling or sensing. So when
No,
and I didn't know at the same time.
Attach it to that feeling.
I just said I feel like this big sense of something and I don't know how to explain it or who to take it to or what to do or whatever. There was really like a feeling of urgency and responsibility at the time. But 2020 came and it almost felt like it was just like green lights go, like boom, go. So I had to in some ways reprocess or re-understand information that I'd been given 3 years prior. And I had to really look at myself and ask myself why I thought my intuition was wrong.
During that time when you were feeling it.
I was very, quote unquote, like disempowered in the time period where I was not accepting some of the things that had come through as messages because they were too strong and I wasn't able to ground them. I wasn't able to understand them. But then as the world events played out, it felt not exactly like validation. It just felt like confirmation for me that I wasn't crazy. So I just wanted to really get my hands dirty or get them wet and then really be devoting myself to something that felt like a skill.
When did you feel that sense of urgency?
At the beginning of, actually it was before the pandemic. It was late October of 2019, so Scorpio season of 2019, I started getting it was like my whole field opened up and it started to come through as a lot of urgency, increasing urgency. It's like, I don't know what's coming, but there's something very big. I don't know what it is. And you don't want to be a fear monger, which is part of the reason why sometimes I'm very uncomfortable with some of the messages that come through because it depends on the receptivity of the person sitting across from you. All of this to say that, yeah, the information was coming in advance and I felt like I didn't know what to do with it. And in some ways I was scared or afraid of the information.
So since then, do you feel similar feelings and handle them in a different way than you did a few years ago?
I'm never going to sit here and talk in the sense where it's like, I've overcome that and I've achieved that. But it's like, because I think the second that you feel like you have like mastered a certain level of life, I think that that's where life can sometimes humble you. It's not about not trusting in reality and in its experience, but I think that when we start to really enter into this egoic state and we are directing our lives from there, where it's like, I'm healed and I'm the healer and all of these things, I think that we actually are limiting ourselves or we're setting ourselves up for our expectations to be in some ways like disillusioned.
So when you feel those feelings, what's the difference between channeling and being psychic and mediumship, like what would that be called, what you were feeling like? I guess if you were to attach it to a category.
And a category.
Because you said that psychics are different.
Yes, they are. And it's like, that was one benefit of having worked for the hotline, is I had a psychic boss, and everyone else on the site was psychic as well. So it was interesting to see how other people were showing up and what their skill sets were. I didn't necessarily interact with them one-on-one, but just hearing, oh, so-and-so reads like this and so-and-so reads like that, you start to understand that everyone's way of interacting with spirit is unique and different. So there's a different skill set for every person. And I think personally that everyone is capable of developing this skill set.
And you would consider yourself as an intuitive, not as a psychic?
I mean, I feel like I sort of took that hat when I worked for the hotline, because there were different classifications that I did not pick, but it was, are you an astrologer? Are you a numerologist? Are you a tarot reader? Are you a psychic? And I guess the reading that I gave just fell into the more psychic, astrologer, tarot reader category. So I was placed with the psychics. So that was challenging when certain people would come on for a reading and they're like, well, I don't want you to use any tools. Or there would be people who had very strong opinions about certain things or the way that certain things were done. That was interesting.
Going back to the feeling you had in October 2019, I want to describe a feeling I had in August 2018, or it was before, maybe July, and I wonder if it was the same thing. I had so one of my big awakenings was the summer of 2018. Okay. What did you feel during your awakening?
Terrified. I felt pure terror. I felt sort of an energetic claustrophobia, or like an energetic it felt like energetic quarantine. It just felt like this, we're not going to call it doom, but in a sense, that's the closest thing that I could describe it to. Is that, and there were other things going on in my life at the time, but it felt like it was just so beyond exaggerated.
I felt the same thing.
That's interesting.
And I know we touched base like a year after we fled from that feeling.
Right.
But now that we're talking about the timing of things, I'm wondering if we felt the same thing. So for me, we were both in the same place. We were both in LA. Right? And I thought it was just circumstantial thing, but I felt something big coming, and I felt like I was in a great danger. And the only thing I could think of, because my mom put it into my head, was there's going to be a huge earthquake. And it felt like in this area, just a surgence of danger coming, and I didn't know when it was going to come, but it felt like overwhelming. And I just knew how to change something. Like I knew how to get out of there. And that's what I felt around that time. And it took years before the pandemic happened, but literally every action I took until the pandemic happened, I feel like has secured me through it. So everything had its own timing. I don't know. That's what I went through, and I wonder if we were both sensing the same thing. Because if you think that we're very intuitive beings on the top of the food chain, and if you think of what animals can sense, like wouldn't we be able to have the same senses for those of us that are more in tune, right? Like if animals can go up a mountain when an earthquake's going to happen. I don't know. Do you feel like that's valid? Like we're supposed to be sensing these things?
I think absolutely we're supposed to be sensing these things. I don't think that we're supposed to be pretending that we don't feel them, because in so many ways we're these evolved animals that just happen to have a society. We wear clothes. We have formalities. So that's unique to us. But if you strip all of that away, we're just these intelligent sort of primal beings. And I can't say that intelligence, meaning mental intelligence, is greater than the more bodily or physical intelligence or intuitive intelligence.
But that's so crazy, because what I spoke of is pertaining to earthly disasters, right? But we went through something, I guess a viral pandemic is an earthly disaster, but I guess you think of disaster as something pertaining to the weather or like the earth. But I wonder if we're in tune in the same way with microbes happening on that kind of scale.
I mean, it was just such a strange year. 2018 was very strange. It was very traumatizing for me for a number of reasons. But yeah, it felt like it was just this like psychic preparation. And, you know, in hindsight, it looked very different than it did while I was experiencing it. Because while I was experiencing it, I was like, I don't know what's going on here. And it just felt, it was just, I'm not even going to call it existential. It was just, there was something that just felt so off. And like nothing was ever going to be put back again.
And your action from that feeling was to leave the area? Was that like the only
so
that you thought of?
I was actually injured, or I injured myself during that time. I had a hernia, or I got a hernia. And if you think about like where a hernia is, its location, it's like sacral solar plexus, like just prime time area. So it really felt like that was when the psychic stuff started really accelerating, because in so many ways it just felt like I was a bathtub with an open drain and the world was just coming through my belly button. It just felt really open and I could not close it. It was not enjoyable. It was not enjoyable. It just felt like having like an open hole in your body, and information it's just you're one with the world.
So I felt like a giant download.
I felt like it was like I was connected to the air and the space around me, because there was just this opening.
That happened during your injury?
Mm-hmm. That was the injury.
Oh, the injury was happening to you.
Yeah.
So it was like an energetic injury.
I think there was energetic injury, but then there was also literal injury, like a hernia. It manifested physically.
You felt the energetic hernia first.
Yes.
The openness, the flowing through you, and then it manifested into a physical hernia.
Both, but then after the hernia, it's like that was open. It was open space for a while.
What did you do to help that? What did you do?
There was really nothing to be done. It was not a good time. It was one of those times where I pulled out every skill in the book, where you would just call in all your resources, because it just felt like I don't know how to describe it. It was genuinely feeling like there was no boundary between myself and the rest of the world.
Was this when you had those 3-hour baths and then you had that giant party? I felt a lot of energy coming from you during that time.
Yeah, I like.
What happened to Madeline?
Yeah, I like don't talk about that era, because it was just, that was the day I got my hernia.
The day? What day?
I got my hernia that day of that party.
Like the beginning of that day? Or
the beginning of that day, I got my hernia.
But you made the plans to invite all those people.
I know.
Before.
So that, like, I was like, I can't cancel now. And so I just was not prepared to have that. I was energetically not okay.
Wow. I wish you could have asked for help.
No, like there's a lot of I feel like there's a lot of embarrassment or shame that comes along with this gift, which is you're so sensitive that you're used to being misunderstood, or to people wanting to misunderstand you, and to help not being given, or judgment being given when you ask for help. So it was just one of those things that felt like it was very solitary.
So the solar plexus has so much meaning. It's like the place of the umbilical cord, of action, of identity.
And I had an umbilical hernia, so it was like it really felt like I was just wide open. Yeah, it's interesting because I never really talk about this stuff because it just feels so bizarre.
But it happened to you. That's great.
I mean, it did, but like it comes with if you're not grounded or you're going through something and you're experiencing sort of psychic stuff at the same time, it just feels, and I've never taken LSD, but it just feels like you're just on hallucinogenics. It's just like, it feels really, sometimes it's just too much, which is why I don't really dabble with drugs.
Because you're already always...
It's already open. There's nothing, I think that if I took something like shrooms, I would just like not come back. I don't know where I would go, but I don't think I would like it. People are like, yeah, you go have ayahuasca. I'm like, I'm good, thanks.
I feel the same way. Since 2018 and all of these years, I felt so much more open that when I see people doing things, I'm like, oh, I never...
No, never. I never want to do that because I don't know where I would go.
Right. Yeah, because you're still trying to ground yourself in your present sober state. Wow. Okay. So what are common misconceptions that you see about astrology or tarot?
So firstly, I would say I'm not here to convince anyone who doesn't believe in astrology to believe in astrology. That's not really my role. But I think that those people who don't believe it either have indicators in their chart that would support them not believing it, or it's just not in their path. But I think that there is a common misconception that it's just a lot of pseudoscience and it's just a lot of whatever. And I think that you have to look at the history of astrology and the fact that a lot of our science was born out of astrology. It really does. If you look at the history of medicine, there was a time when the astrologers were in so many ways functioning as the doctors. I think as well, like most astrology that people are familiar with is like solar astrology. It's essentially when you ask someone, what is your sign? That's solar astrology. It's where was the sun when you were born and what sign. But it's like that is really only giving you a person's ego. It's not telling you anything beyond that. So we know what the general identity is, or what this person is what their shell in some ways is going to be, but we can't see anything else beyond that. So I feel like it's very limiting, and there's so much more level of detail available, but I think that people either dismiss it for whatever reason, or for their own understanding of it, or they're just not familiar with it.
And what about for tarot?
You know, tarot is a whole other topic as well, but if you look at like the laws, for instance, around, and I can't believe that I'm mentioning this, but I am, but if you look at the laws around astrology and tarot or any of these things, they haven't been updated since the time when we're like in circus tents with crystal balls. So there's really been no sort of formal recognition for either of these skills by like the status quo population. And I feel like that is changing, but I feel like tarot is like people just think you're like in a corner with something on your head and you're burning incense. And I'm not saying that that's not part of it, but it's bigger than just the aesthetics and the mood and the vibe. Okay,
so what does a session with you look like?
I was trained actually to be a personal coach. So a lot of my use of astrology or of tarot is it's collaborative. It's me asking questions, and then from there, I'm using the tools that I have in order to translate the message. But my sessions are very client driven, or again, like dual driven. And I think that it depends. I'm always asking a person, why are they there? What brings them there? Because that is something that I think is going to give you the intention for what that person, why they've arrived. Why are they here? So it's not, okay, I'm going to tell you this great story or whatever. It's, what are you looking for? Because in a sense, the astrology and the tarot is so vast and so wide and has so many possibilities that the importance of the questions that we're asking, like, we can't underestimate that. The question is more important, I think, than the ability to read the answer.
And our questions do get more fine-tuned and detailed as we ask them, don't they? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've learned that over the years too. It's like, oh, my questions are so much better than the questions I asked years ago. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, and just to clarify, during these readings, you're not talking to past loved ones or spirits, like you don't do that? No.
Occasionally, again, there will be like a guide who presents itself, and I'll say, okay, there's someone here, but like that's rare. It's that's not the norm. It's what's the energy? Let's just take a net and let's just reel it in. What is the energy? That's, you can start generally from there. I think if someone is having an astrology reading, for instance, I think that if it's their first time having a reading, in some ways it functions as a sort of hard reset, because we're working with the birth, we're working with the origin point, we're working with everything that happened after that moment. So everything is grown out of that seed. The seed of potential is in that chart. So an act usually of someone, for instance, trying to find their birth time or find information is a reconnection with their origin. Whether it's reconnecting to family members, reconnecting with their mother, reconnecting with other people, just the act of getting ready for having your chart read puts you into that state of, okay, where am I from?
So charts have timelines of when things are supposed to occur. You can read those?
It's not when... I don't look at anything in astrology as supposed to. I look at it as, here are symbols that are showing up, that are showing possibilities. It doesn't mean that all of those things are going to happen or should happen, etc. It just means here's a boat of potential that arrives at this time.
So would you say that boat of potential within each individual's chart is more likely than another person's boat of potential? Like, what determines something that's a potential and something that is likely? It's like, why is there a difference at all? You know what I mean? Like, why does it show up, and what determines them running into those potentials versus being able to steer clear of it? I guess that is asking about free will and even knowing about those elements of potential, right?
So
that was a lot in that question.
No. But I like questions like that, and that goes back to what my astrologer used to say to me. He would say, the astrology doesn't know who you are, when you are, where you are. The astrology is inherently neutral. It's just an energy pattern. So you could have a chart and it's like the blueprint of a house, but you don't know what that person has actually built in real time. You don't know, based on their environment, how much of their potential they've actually been able to harness and what they will harness in this life. That is contextual. So that's where, to me, astrology it's important to be having a sort of conversation about it, because I could be looking at a chart and say, wow, this person looks like they are so, insert whatever, they're so creative, and then a person comes in and they're not experiencing that, they're not feeling that. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you will find, okay, there were a lot of barriers in their life that blocked them from ever seeing that. So their openness to their own potential is not always there.
So a blueprint is not destiny?
Correct. A blueprint, at least the way that I see it, a blueprint is not what is actually built. A blueprint is a blueprint. What you build in the 3D, that's a combination of free will, ego, what you've attracted in your dharma your karma, etc. But I think that it's also, just conditioning.
Interesting.
If I can say an example, for instance, let's take an Aries woman, for instance. Let's take her and put her in the year 1950. Aries, first of all, is a very masculine sign. To have a woman in this sign is already creating some internal friction, because there's a lot of that feisty energy that comes through, or that impulsive Mars energy that comes through. Now we add context. Now it's, okay, let's put this woman in 1950. We may have a very outspoken, individualistic woman who does not follow, whatever it is she's expected to do, but she's grown up in a world that requires her to become a certain something. So with every generation, we have those factors at play. If we put someone in a free country as opposed to somewhere where there's oppression, they're going to have different charts and different outcomes, even if it's showing up as the same birthday.
Kind of like epigenetics.
Exactly. It's like the experience is being shaped both from the inside and from the outside.
Okay, so astrology is like a person, they're a ball of clay with the ball of makeup, whatever they're made up of, and then based upon where they're put in their environment is how they're going to be molded.
And you can see what was built or what was not built when you start to talk to a person. So it's that thread is the important part, because I can look at something here in the quote unquote, like the astrology x-ray, and that won't match the outside. So it's okay. So then it becomes, well, how far out, not necessarily how far out of alignment is this person, but it's like, are they following their path? Are they following their chart or not? If you mention sort of potentials from this chart, are they in touch with that or not? Because that becomes something that you start to gauge. Sometimes astrology for some people is not the tool, or they're just, it's not the one. That's okay.
So if we're made with a certain blueprint, would you say that if we're living a life that's aligned with the potentials of our blueprint, it will feel right? Like, do you think like our inner selves feel that alignment that feels different than using our free will to choose another path?
Yes and no. I think that you have to, in some ways, look at like, in so many ways you can look at a chart sometimes, and you can see what a soul may be trying to accomplish in this lifetime. So again, separate from what a person has built or who they are, you can see energetically, okay, this person isn't quote unquote here yet, but I can see there's several indicators of their soul trying to learn something in this life, because it comes up in multiple places. So you can bring awareness to those points, but it's ultimately going to be up to the person what they do with that. I don't know if that fully answered your question or if I even fully finished my thought there. But to me, astrology is not something where it's like, it's prescriptive and it's like, you are this and therefore that. It's like, I think if you learn your own chart well enough, in a way, it becomes just like anything else. You can, in some ways, transcend it or go beyond it, where the astrology in some ways becomes irrelevant because you've already understood its mechanisms. In other words, you're not imprisoned by it anymore because you know how the energy is operating, so you're aware of when certain things are coming up.
So you're not blindsided by your random emotions and desires.
Well, it's not that you wouldn't be, it's just there are, I think, opportunities with astrology to see, okay, this looks like this is part of, not really the programming, but it's like, okay, this is familiar. I've been here. I've done this before. I've felt this before. So when you can recognize that is when you can detach from it, or you can interact with it, or you can channel it, whatever you're going to do with the energy from there.
It's like knowing the map ahead of time.
It's knowing the map.
Okay. So when you say that you can see a person trying to achieve this potential in their chart or something, does that mean that they had previously chosen this blueprint and this set of goals, or is it something through our energetic patterns that we are born into, like a magnet, like we're magnetized to this life with this body, or is it something we chose?
To be honest, I don't know if I have an opinion on that. I don't know if I have an answer to that, because I think that's the question that we're all asking. So in some ways, for me to answer that or to be so sure of that it just feels too done for me. For me, astrology it's a tool. It's not an end.
I guess that question kind of pokes at the idea of free will. It's like, okay, well, I have this map and I can choose to go outside this map, but I chose this map, didn't I? Or did I not choose this map that I can choose to travel outside? You know, it's just poking at the idea.
Spoken like a true Sag.
Is that a Sagittarius?
Yes, very, very philosophical, but yeah, I don't have the answer to that, because I think those are different schools of thought, and I think that you can apply all of them, and one is not going to be more correct than the other. They're just going to be a school of thought.
Okay, so we know you work with astrology readings and tarot readings. Are there other types of readings or light work mediums that you work with?
I work with frequencies, with sound frequencies and meditation a lot. I also work with stones a lot, with paint as well. So paint or collage. Those are pretty much my primary tools.
Okay. And in terms of helping others, what mediums do you use primarily? If someone wanted a session with you?
I try to be using what appears to be or what intuitively feels as if it's the most right fit. And sometimes that's not immediate, but it's just a sense with certain things. It's almost, to me, astrology versus tarot is saying, do you want the really finely prepared French meal by the French trained chef, or do you want your mother's home cooking? They're two very different things. They're both masters at their craft or what they do, but they have different tones. You're not going to have some gastronomic 12-course meal that's molecular at your mother's. It's not going to happen. I mean, it might happen, but a chef may give you more interesting flavors or more kind of make your palate think, whereas your mom might just feel familiar or relaxing.
And you help determine what
are you in the mood for? What is your spirit calling for? What might resonate more for you? And people usually have a pretty clear opinion, and the ones who don't or don't have a preference, it's pretty just okay, we're gonna see what this does.
All right, what are your readings not?
But that's a good question. My readings are not fortune telling. My readings are not me trying to make someone believe in something that they don't believe. My readings are not therapy. I'm not a doctor. So my readings in many ways are their entry points or their thresholds to healing. But I feel as if there are so many other healers that I think have valuable skills as well. This is really just a primer point or a supplement in some ways. But yeah, I think that without these tools, I don't know where I would be. I think that they are great tools for emotional self-regulation. I think that a tool like tarot, for instance, this is not a prescription, but I think for people who have things like OCD, where they're very obsessive, or maybe they have an anxious sort of attachment, tarot can come in and help realign that until the pattern, in some ways, I'm not going to say it dies, but it's you can catch yourself. You can be more in tune with, okay, now I'm acting out this pattern. And sometimes you can't see it in other areas.
Do you have any stories you want to share?
I know I have good ones back in there somewhere, but I'm just, nothing's popping out at me right now. See, anything beyond that makes me feel like we're talking about Madelin now versus talking about like astrology. I've had so many teachers in my life that I respected so much, or they served as these guardian sorts of figures. But I think that anytime you're putting the teacher up on a pedestal, or you're looking at them as they have more knowledge than I do, you're at a deficit, and you're also setting yourself up for failure. So I feel as if this is happening in several realms, like healthcare as well, where there's a sort of toppling of the hierarchy in the way that things have been structured, or one-on-one relationships, not romantic, have been structured, where there's more of an equalization, or coming at it from the angle of peer versus hierarchy. So that's really where I try to veer from, I guess, what I was raised with in this realm, where I don't want to be seen as either above or below people, or a person with some sort of X-Man sort of skill. I feel like this is something that I have developed over time, and yes, I've had trauma and different sorts of things and worked with energy for a really long time, so in that regards I'm more developed. But I think that if people are open, this is something that can be developed. It's not like a superhero skill.
Maybe when I ask so many questions that are personal to you, and you feel like you're talking a lot about yourself, maybe that's what you feel like you're being put on a pedestal. I don't know if that's true, but I just feel like, when I'm asking these questions and we're learning about you, then we get to see you as a person.
Yeah.
And how you got to that point. And like for me, it's like I know your story, and it's like, wow, you went through a lot. You did not have a happy beginning.
No.
You're still working through everything. So like it's just admirable to me to be able to see the whole picture of you, as opposed to maybe your teacher. I don't know if you know the whole picture of your teachers, and that's what makes it easy for us to put people on a pedestal, is if you just see their strengths that they have accumulated through all of their struggles.
Yeah, and I think that that's where I am different as well as a reader, is I am not a reader who's always just reading for the positive or reading for the strengths, because to me, it's like, yes, it's for entertainment purposes only, but like I'm not just there to be an entertainer, if that makes sense. Like I'm not here to entertain with information. I'm here to connect.
Right.
So I don't in my readings, I'm looking for where there are extra beams available that we don't know about, that may provide us with additional support, where there are extra skill sets or tools. And again, everyone's going to come in with a different sort of agenda or wanting a different sort of thing out of a reading. But, I think it just depends on the person.
Well, thank you for your time, Madelin.
Thank you.
Been amazing. Can you tell us where we can find you and learn more about you?
So I'm still building all of my sites. I've actually launched one of my sites, but then I was like, no, wait, I'm not ready. So it's in a soft launch sort of phase, but you can find me on YouTube under the Fire Fodder Tarot. I guess you'll have the link for that. And you can also find me on Instagram under my full name.
Okay. I'll have that listed below. Have I been saying tarot the wrong?
No, you can say tarot or tarot or whatever. It's just some days I feel like saying tomato and the other days tomato.
Oh yeah, mom's cooking or chef. All right. I like tarot.
Just feel like it sounds a little bit like
More
the tarot.
All
right.
Thank you, Madelin.
Thank you, Lana.